The rain had just let up when I stepped out of my car. The sky still a pale slate gray, the last droplets sliding off the eaves of the apartment building in slow, fat streaks. It was early evening, the kind of April evening when winter hasn't fully released its grip, leaving a chill in the air that seeps through thin layers of clothing. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint, sweet odor of damp earth from the narrow strip of overgrown grass along the side of the building. I had returned from a long day of work, my shoes leaving dark prints across the concrete walkway. As I reached for the keys, the wind pushed a sharp note of cold through the collar of my jacket. I had moved into the building 6 months ago, and the unit above mine had been empty since the previous tenant moved out. Yet every night, consistently, I heard it. Faint footsteps on the creaking wooden floors, the subtle drag of something heavy, the occasional thump, almost as if someone had dropped a book or adjusted a chair. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination, the building settling, the sound of pipes carrying water elsewhere. But over the weeks, the noises became too patterned, too human. Tonight, as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, I felt the familiar knot of tension in my stomach. The interior smelled faintly of rain and old wood. I set my keys on the table and paused, listening. A soft thump above, like the scraping of chair legs on hardwood. I froze, willing my eyes to adjust to the dim light of the single lamp I had left on. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate, almost rhythmical. My mind cataloged every possibility. The building settling, rats in the attic, some kind of echo from the neighboring unit. None fit neatly. I felt the instinctive itch to leave, to retreat to the safety of my car or the streets where I could see and control my surroundings. I moved toward the window that faced the small courtyard between buildings. The rain had left puddles that reflected the neon glow of a streetlight. The smell of wet concrete and moss hit me again, sharp and sweet. I crouched slightly, pressing my fingers against the cold glass, trying to peer up at the empty unit above. The blinds were closed. Nothing moved. I decided to do what I had done countless nights before. Investigate the sound by process of elimination, in the calm, measured way one does when alone in a strange place. My apartment was old, the floors uneven, and every step I took seemed to amplify the creaks above. I walked slowly toward the center of my apartment, a corner of my mind calculating the acoustics. The footsteps, I noticed, didn't correspond to any structure in my own unit. The sounds weren't random. They moved deliberately from one end of the upper floor to the other. I turned on the small recorder I kept by my bed, a precaution I had started after a particularly unnerving night. Its soft red light blinked, a silent witness. I let it run and returned to the couch, wrapping my hands around a mug of tea, the warmth a small anchor. The room was quiet for a few minutes, and then a chair scrape, faint but distinct. My pulse accelerated slightly. I considered calling the building management, but I remembered the past tenants' stories, how they had dismissed similar noises as quirks of old structures. I wanted proof before involving anyone, something tangible. After what felt like an eternity of silent listening, I made a decision. I would go upstairs. The apartment was empty, and the door had no lock. Every step I took on the staircase was deliberate, testing for creaks, memorizing their sounds, noting where the wooden steps gave slightly under my weight. I paused halfway up, hand on the railing, listening. Nothing, just the distant drip of rainwater from a loose gutter outside, the occasional rustle of leaves in the courtyard. My palms were slick with sweat despite the chill. I told myself that fear was a tool, sharpening my awareness, not a signal to retreat to the top of the stairs. I lingered, looking down the narrow hallway that led to the vacant unit. The air smelled of damp plaster and faint mildew. I noticed a subtle difference in temperature near the door, slightly colder, almost imperceptibly so. I pressed my ear to the door, and there it was, the unmistakable shuffle of feet, moving toward the far corner, pausing, a soft thump as though something had been dropped or shifted. I took a step back, letting my shoulder brush against the wall. Collecting my thoughts, I knew better than to rush. I retrieved my flashlight, the kind with a broad beam and a solid, weighty grip. The beam cut a sharp line across the hallway as I approached the door. I placed my hand on the doorknob. It was cold, inert, unyielding. No lock, no handle resistance, nothing that should have prevented entry. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears, but I let it guide my pacing, not control my actions. Slowly, I opened the door. The apartment was exactly as it had been 6 months ago. Barren, stripped of personal effects, the air still carrying that faint mildew-scented tang of abandonment. The hardwood floors were polished in the pale light of the setting sun, the walls slightly scuffed but otherwise unremarkable. I stepped inside, flashlight sweeping the corners, shining under windows, across empty shelves. Silence, only silence. Then I heard it again, soft footsteps, not from the floor, but from inside the apartment, above where I stood. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming, yet curiosity rooted me in place. I moved slowly, tracing the sound, flashlight casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. In the living room, the beam landed on the edge of a rug, slightly lifted, as though something beneath had been nudged recently. A cold draft brushed past me, carrying the faint smell of damp earth, inexplicably outside. Yet there it was, inside the empty apartment that I paused, letting the air settle. The sounds continued intermittently, furniture shifting, soft thuds. My mind cataloged every rational possibility. Whined through an open vent, the building settling, rodents. None satisfied the clarity of my perception. The apartment was silent when I moved, yet the noises returned as soon as I stopped. It felt deliberate, like a message I couldn't yet decode, and I made small decisions, almost ritualistic. Touching the walls, listening at corners, leaning against door frames to feel for vibrations, even placing my hand lightly on the hardwood floor. Each action was slow, deliberate, measured. The atmosphere was thick, almost tactile, each breath drawing in the subtle odors of wet wood and dust. Outside, the wind rustled trees in the courtyard, shaking off remnants of rainwater. Occasionally, the distant sound of a car or a dog barking punctuated the monotony. After several minutes of cautious exploration, I stepped back, leaning against the wall near the doorway. The apartment, by all visible signs, remained empty. Yet the footsteps continued, echoing softly from above, almost teasingly, as if acknowledging my presence but refusing revelation. I realized in that moment that the apartment was a space defined less by physical occupancy and more by perception, by attention. Every creak, every subtle shift of air, was amplified by the human mind's natural anticipation. I felt a strange kinship with the building itself, sensing its age, its quirks, and the imprint of prior human lives lingering in subtle vibrations and scents. I left the unit that night, careful to close the door without making unnecessary noise. Back in my apartment, I sat at the window again, mug in hand, listening. The footsteps faded gradually, replaced by the steady drip of residual rain from the eaves, the occasional rustle of wind in the courtyard trees. I reflected on the sensations, on the patience required to navigate fear calmly, and the heightened awareness that came from deliberate, measured observation. Over the following weeks, I continued the practice. Each night, I would listen, record, and sometimes venture upstairs, each action taken slowly, thoughtfully. The footsteps never appeared in the daytime, never when other humans were present. I began to notice patterns. They moved with subtle rhythm, almost like a faint echo of prior activity, as if the building retained memory in its floorboards, walls, and ceilings. The air smelled faintly of wood polish at certain times, dust shifting with invisible currents. The apartment became a lesson in patience, in observation, in accepting uncertainty while remaining grounded. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of wildlife through the windows in the courtyard below. A sparrow brushing wet leaves, a cat prowling along fences, a squirrel shaking water from its tail. Their movements were deliberate, calm, unhurried, and reminded me to match their rhythm in my own approach to the unknown. Encounters with other humans were equally measured, brief nods with neighbors, small greetings that reinforced the notion of shared, but separate, spaces. I never solved the mystery entirely. No one had moved in, no evidence suggested intrusion. Yet the footsteps persisted, a nightly companion, a subtle test of attention and composure. The experience became a meditation, a slow exercise in the art of careful perception, and the importance of grounding oneself in sensory awareness. The building, in its silent, aged way, taught me that not all presences are tangible, that some realities exist in echoes, vibrations, and subtleties, and that fear, when met with measured observation, becomes insight rather than paralysis. By the end of that season, I had learned to move through the apartment with the same deliberate, calm pace I had learned in the forest during hikes. Listening, observing, feeling the space, noting the minute shifts in sound and air. The footsteps above became less a source of dread and more a marker of attentiveness, a reminder of the invisible layers of experience around me. Each night, I would sip tea, eyes closed or fixed on the window, letting the faint sounds carry through me, feeling my pulse, breathing in the cool, damp air, and reflecting on the quiet resilience of the human mind when it faces the unknown with patience rather than panic. The lesson lingered. Not every question requires an answer, not every presence a confrontation. Some mysteries exist to teach attention, composure, and the profound connection between perception and environment. And sometimes, the faint echo of footsteps in an empty apartment is simply a reminder that even absence has weight, and that listening closely, truly listening, can reveal more than any visible presence ever could. The nights continued, quiet but alive, and I learned to move among the echoes, to walk through the shadowed spaces of the apartment with deliberate steps, and to respect the silent rhythms of a place that had become, in its own subtle way, a companion. The decision to explore the old Miller's Grove Elementary School was made on one of those languid, late August afternoons where the summer heat begins to curdle into something heavier, more melancholic. The air was thick with humidity, pressing down on the Rust Belt town of Beacon like a warm, damp cloth. School was due to start for the year in just over a week, and for my friends and me, Leo, Maya, and myself, this felt like a final, necessary act of rebellion against the impending structure of the school year. We were not reckless vandals. We considered ourselves archivists of the forgotten, documenting the slow decay of places that time had left behind. The school sat on a large, overgrown lot at the end of Sycamore Street, a street that itself seemed to be giving up, the pavement cracking under the assault of weeds. The building was a two-story brick structure from the 1950s, its windows either boarded up or staring out with the dark, empty gaze of broken glass. A chain-link fence, rusted and sagging in places, surrounded the property, but a section behind a thicket of overgrown lilac bushes had been peeled back by countless previous visitors. We slipped through this known gap, the metal cold and gritty against my palm despite the heat. The grounds were a testament to 30 years of neglect. The skeletal remains of swing sets stood in a field of yellowed, knee-high grass. A large oak tree, probably once a proud centerpiece of the playground, had shed a massive limb across the asphalt of the basketball court, the blacktop itself bulging and splitting like old leather. The air smelled of hot, dry grass, damp earth, and the faint, sweet odor of decaying leaves from seasons long past. Crickets sawed their legs together in a relentless, buzzing chorus, a sound so constant it became the soundtrack of the silence itself. Leo, ever the pragmatist, had a heavy-duty flashlight, which he clicked on even though it was still daylight. "Basement's bound to be a black hole," he said, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. Maya, our photographer, had her digital camera slung around her neck, its lens cap already off. She was the one who noticed the silence first. "No birds," she whispered, her head tilted. She was right. The trees that crowded the edges of the property were still and vacant. Our plan was simple, a safety strategy we always followed. Stick together, never go into a room without checking the floor for stability, and have a pre-agreed exit point, in this case, the hole in the fence. We would be in and out before the late afternoon light began to fail. The main entrance was sealed with a heavy plywood board, but a side door, once a metal fire exit, was slightly ajar, its lock long since broken. The gap was just wide enough to squeeze through sideways, and the act of entering felt like a violation. A crossing of a threshold into a space that demanded stillness. The interior was a world of muted light and suffocating air. We found ourselves in a long, wide hallway, the floor a checkerboard of faded green and white tiles, now coated in a fine, gray dust. The smell was the first thing that truly struck me. A complex layering of mildew, dry rot, and the ghostly scent of chalk dust and old paper. It was the smell of time standing still, and it caught in the back of my throat. Our footsteps, even though we tried to be quiet, echoed with a hollow, gritty finality. Slanted columns of sunlight cut through the broken windows and the gaps in the boards, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced like agitated spirits. Classroom doors stood open, revealing frozen tableaus of abandonment. Small desks were scattered, some overturned. A forgotten geography map, still half rolled down over a blackboard, showed a world that no longer existed. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting beams through the deep shadows, revealing water-stained ceiling tiles that hung down like tongues, and peeling posters about the solar system. The sun bleached to a pale yellow orb that we had been inside for perhaps 20 minutes, exploring the ground floor classrooms, when Maya paused at the entrance to what must have been the main office. "Guys," she said, her voice barely a breath. She pointed her flashlight beam at the wall behind the reception counter. It was an attendance list. It was printed on a fresh, clean sheet of white paper, the kind that comes out of a laser printer, stark and new. It was tacked to a crumbling corkboard with a single, bright blue thumbtack. The heading read Miller's Grove Elementary, Homeroom 104, week of August 28th. Below it were 2 columns of names, 20 in total. Children's names: Emily Carter, Jacob Miller, Sophia Rodriguez. The date was the impossible thing. It was current. This week was the last week of August. School started the Tuesday after Labor Day, which was next week. August 28th was next Monday. A coldness, entirely separate from the stagnant air, traced a path down my spine. "This is a joke," Leo said, his usual bravado gone. He reached out and touched the corner of the paper. It was smooth and firm. It hadn't been here for years. It felt like it had been printed yesterday. There was no dust on its surface. "Who would do this?" Maya asked, her camera held limply at her side. She hadn't taken a picture. Felt wrong somehow to document this. This wasn't part of the decay. This was an insertion, a violation of the natural order of abandonment. I looked around the office. Everything else was in a state of advanced ruin. The desk was a mess of dried-out pens and rodent droppings. A telephone, its cord chewed through, lay on the floor. The computer monitor was an ancient, heavy block of beige plastic, its screen dark and dusty. This single, pristine piece of paper was an anomaly so profound it felt like a physical blow. My instincts, which had been humming with the low-level thrill of urban exploration, were now screaming a high-frequency warning. This was not right. This was not a prank. The effort was too meticulous, the context too bizarre. A prank would have been a scrawled, "I was here," or something obscene. This was administrative. This was normal. And its normality, in this place, was the most terrifying thing of all. We stood in silence for a long moment, the beam of Leo's flashlight trembling slightly on the list of names. The dust motes seemed to slow their dance in the light. The only sound was the faint, dry buzz of a fly somewhere deeper in the building. "Let's go," I said, my voice firm, surprising even myself. The others nodded, a silent, immediate consensus. The thrill was gone, replaced by a deep, primal urge to leave. We turned from the office and moved back into the main hallway, our pace quicker now, our careful exploration forgotten. We were retracing our steps, past the open classroom doors that now seemed less like frozen tableaus and more like empty eye sockets. We were halfway to the side entrance when we heard it was a sound that should not have existed in that building. The clear, resonant tone of a single piano key being struck. It came from the far end of the hallway, from the direction of the auditorium. We froze. The sound hung in the thick air, vibrant and alive, before fading into a silence that felt deeper and more profound than before. Leo swung his flashlight beam down the long corridor. The circle of light danced over the tiles, but the far end was swallowed by darkness. "An animal," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. A rat couldn't press a piano key with that kind of singular musical clarity. Then, another sound. This one was softer, a rustling, shuffling noise. It was the sound of fabric, of movement. It was coming from a classroom to our left, one we had passed just moments before. I was certain the doorway had been empty. Now, a shadow seemed to detach itself from the deeper blackness within the room that it was the shape of a person, small and slight, a child. It stood just beyond the threshold, a silhouette against the dim light from a grimy window behind it. I could not see its face, only its outline. It did not move toward us. It simply stood, watching. My breath hitched in my throat. Every rational thought told me it was another explorer, a homeless person, a trick of the light. But the attendance list had rewired my perception of this place. The rules had changed. The air grew colder, the smell of mildew sharpening, now carrying a faint, coppery undertone like old pennies. Maya let out a small, choked sound. The figure in the doorway took a single, shuffling step forward into the hallway. It was a boy, I thought, though it was hard to tell. He was dressed in clothes that seemed oddly out of date, corduroy pants, a simple collared shirt. His face was still in shadow. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, deliberate pointing gesture. He was pointing past us, back down the hallway from which we had come, towards the auditorium, towards the source of the piano note. We did not wait. We broke into a run. Our careful, quiet steps were replaced by a frantic, slapping cacophony on the dusty tiles. Leo's flashlight beam jolted and bounced wildly, creating a strobe light effect of fleeting, nightmare images. A fallen chair, a drinking fountain leaking a dark stain, a single child's sneaker lying on its side. I dared a glance over my shoulder. The hallway behind us was empty. The boy was gone. But from the auditorium, the piano sounded again. Not a single note this time, but a clumsy, discordant chord, as if a fist had been brought down on the keys. We burst through the side door, the broken metal catching on my jacket and tearing it. We didn't stop. We scrambled through the hole in the fence, the rusted links tearing at our clothes and skin, and didn't slow our pace until we were a block away, standing under the humming, modern glow of a street lamp on Sycamore Street. We leaned over, hands on our knees, gasping in the warm, humid, but blessedly normal air of the outside world. We never spoke of it again. Not really. We tried once, in the safety of a brightly lit diner over greasy fries. We attempted to rationalize it. The list was an elaborate art project. The boy was a squatter's kid. The piano, settling pipes, a bird, anything. But the explanations were tissue paper thin, and they crumpled under the weight of the shared, unshakable certainty in our eyes. We had stumbled into a place where time was not just broken, but actively malfunctioning. We had seen the machinery of reality stutter, and the glimpse had left a permanent chill in our bones. The lesson I took from the abandoned school was not about ghosts, not in the traditional sense. It was about resonance. Some places, I believe, absorb the intensity of the human emotions that occur within them. A school is a cauldron of anticipation, of fear, of boredom, and of joy, repeated daily for decades. Perhaps under the right conditions, that energy can pool and thicken, and the echo can become so strong it begins to anticipate its own source. We weren't seeing the past that day. The attendance list, the child, the piano, they felt like a preview, a rehearsal. The building was practicing, getting ready for a school year that would never come, trapped in a perpetual, agonizing state of almost. I learned that some doors should remain closed, not because of what is behind them, but because of what might be waiting patiently for its turn to begin.
The last of the daylight was a thin, bruised purple in the west, smeared behind the skeletal fingers of the leafless oaks and hickories. It was late November in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, and the air had a wet, penetrating cold that found its way through the layers of my fleece and denim jacket. I'd been stupid, of course. That's the prelude to every story like this. A simple afternoon hike on the well-marked Pine Ridge Trail, one I'd done a dozen times with my dad, had turned into a panicked, hours-long ordeal the moment I decided to take a shortcut to a waterfall he'd once pointed out on a map. The map, like my phone, was now useless, its screen a web of cracks from a fall on a slick, moss-covered incline. The only thing it had retained was a sliver of battery life, just enough to cast a feeble, mocking glow before it died completely. leaving me in a deep, country darkness I had never truly experienced before. The woods at night are not silent. That's a city person's fantasy. They are a cacophony of unseen life and settling earth. Twigs snapped like gunshots to my left. The rustle of something moving through the dry leaf litter sounded like a giant shuffling carts. My own breath was a ragged, steam-plumed roar in my ears. I'd been following the slope of the land downwards, a desperate strategy based on the simple logic that water flows downhill and civilization often follows water. My throat was parched, my legs trembled with a deep, muscular fatigue, and a cold fear had taken root in my stomach, a hard, icy knot that tightened with every unfamiliar sound. Then I saw it, a faint, sodium orange glow through the trees. Not the warm yellow of a house window, but the harsh, industrial glare of a security light. I nearly wept with relief. Pushing through a final thicket of clawing blackberry brambles, I stumbled out onto a ribbon of cracked asphalt, a back road so minor it was barely more than a driveway. Across it, set in a small clearing carved out of the woods, was a gas station. It was a relic, a place time had forgotten. The sign, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent tube, read Holloway's Fill and Go in faded, 1970s-era script. One of the two fuel pumps was shrouded in a black trash bag. The main building, a low-slung box of grimy cinder block, was dark, but the light I'd seen came from a single, bare bulb mounted above a lone bathroom door on the side of the building, accessible from the outside. The place was clearly closed. There were no cars. The silence out here on the road was even more profound than in the woods, a vast, empty bowl broken only by the erratic fizz pop of the failing light bulb. But that bathroom, it represented shelter. 4 walls and a lockable door. It was the closest thing to safety I had encountered in hours. I could wait there until morning, or until any car came by. I hurried across the asphalt, my hiking boots sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. The door was heavy, made of steel, and painted a grimy, institutional green. It was unlocked. I slipped inside, fumbling for the light switch. A weak, yellowish light flickered on from a frosted glass fixture overhead, illuminating a scene of profound neglect. The room was small, with a toilet, a small sink with a single, rust-stained tap, and a metal mirror so spotted and corroded my reflection was a ghostly smudge. The air was thick with the smell of stale urine, ancient mildew, and the cloying sweetness of chemical air freshener from a dispenser that had long since emptied its cartridge. The floor was concrete, gritty with tracked in dirt. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. I engaged the lock, a heavy, chrome bolt that slid into the steel doorframe with a solid, satisfying thunk. I was safe. For the first time in hours, I allowed my body to relax, slumping against the cold cinder block wall. I slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the wall, facing the door. I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to conserve warmth, and listened. The erratic buzzing of the outside light was muffled now, a distant, mechanical cicada. I could hear the wind picking up, a low moan as it swept through the pines that pressed in on the clearing. I checked my dead phone again, a futile gesture. 10:17 p.m. It felt like a lifetime had passed since I'd fallen. I must have dozed off, lulled by the sheer exhaustion and the relative safety of my locked box. What woke me wasn't a sound, but a sensation. A vibration, deep and low, transmitted through the concrete floor into my spine. It was a rhythmic, like the footfall of something impossibly heavy. My eyes snapped open. The single bulb in the ceiling flickered, sending jittering shadows dancing across the walls. I held my breath, my entire body tensed into a single, taut wire of alarm. The sound was coming from the main building. It was the sound of a door being forced. Not a sharp, splintering crack, but a long, groaning shriek of tortured metal being torn from its hinges. It was followed by a silence so deep and complete I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Then, the heavy footsteps began again, now from inside the connected building. They were slow, deliberate, and each one was accompanied by a secondary sound, a dry, scraping drag, like a heavy sack being pulled over rough concrete. The thing was in the gas station shop. I could hear it moving, a vast, ponderous presence on the other side of the cinder block wall my back was pressed against. Glass crunched under its weight. A metal shelf shrieked as it was pushed aside or toppled. I pressed my palms flat against the cold floor, the vibration now a constant, unsettling hum. This was no bear. No animal, no matter how large, moved with that kind of deliberate, dragging weight. My mind, scrambling for any kind of rational anchor, came up empty. My earlier fear, the cold knot in my stomach, was now a white-hot panic, a screaming animal instinct to flee, but there was nowhere to go. I was in a concrete trap. The footsteps moved towards the wall that separated the main store from my bathroom. They stopped right on the other side. I could hear a low, wet, rattling breath, like air being forced through a clogged pipe. It was sniffing, a long, drawn-in sniff that seemed to go on for a full minute. I squeezed my eyes shut as if that could make me invisible. The thing on the other side of the wall was smelling the air, smelling the station, smelling me. Then, the footsteps moved again. They weren't heading away. They were moving towards the hallway. My bathroom, I now realized, was at the end of a short, L-shaped corridor that connected it to the main store. The interior door to that corridor, which I had assumed was locked, was now my point of greatest vulnerability. The footsteps entered the hallway. The acoustics changed instantly. The sounds became closer, more contained, more intimate. Thump, drag. Thump, drag. Each impact was a little louder, a little closer. The dragging sound resolved itself now into something metallic. Chains. It was dragging chains. Not a single chain, but a collection of them, links of various sizes scraping and clinking and rattling over the floor tiles with that agonizing, slow progression. The light bulb flickered violently, plunging the room into near darkness for a second before stuttering back to life. I scrambled away from the wall, pressing myself into the far corner between the toilet and the sink. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I wrapped my arms around my knees, making myself as small as possible, my eyes fixed on the thin sliver of space under the steel door. The hallway light was off, but the orange glow from the outside security light seeped underneath, painting a faint, sickly stripe on the filthy floor. A shadow fell across that stripe of light. It was immense, blotting out the glow completely, plunging my side of the door into utter blackness. The footsteps stopped. The dragging chains slithered to a halt with a final, metallic sigh. It was right outside the door. So close. I could smell it now, a new scent cutting through the mildew and urine, the smell of old soil, of damp rot, of cold iron, and something else, something coppery and foul, like old blood. There was no handle on my side of the door, just the lock. There was no way for it to turn a knob, but that didn't seem to matter. The thing outside let out another one of those wet, rattling breaths, this time directly against the door. I saw the metal of the door, just at the seam, flex inward slightly, as if a great weight were leaning against it. It was testing the door. A sound began, low and guttural. It wasn't a growl, not an animal sound. It was a voice, but one ground down to gravel, a whisper that seemed to be made of dust and decay. I couldn't make out words, only the cadence, a low, monotonous chant that vibrated through the steel and into my very bones. It was speaking, or something like it. The lock, the solid chrome bolt that had been my symbol of security, suddenly felt flimsy, a child's toy. I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body was locked. I was a statue of terror, frozen in that grimy corner. The chanting stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the oppressive weight of its presence just inches away. Then, the handle on the outside of the door jiggled. It was a small, almost polite sound, a faint tink-tink of metal on metal. It was so mundane, so human, that it was somehow more terrifying than any roar could have been. It jiggled again, a little harder this time. The door shuddered in its frame. The lock held. A low rumble started in its chest, a sound of pure frustration that I felt in my teeth. The jiggling stopped. A new sound began. A slow, deliberate scraping. Something metal was being dragged down the length of the door, from top to bottom. It was one of the chains. I could hear individual links catching and scraping on the painted steel. It was marking the door. It was letting me know it was still there. The shadow did not move from under the door. The oppressive darkness remained. It had settled in. It wasn't trying to break the door down. It was waiting. It had all the time in the world, and I was trapped. My mind raced through my options, each more pathetic than the last. The window above the toilet was a small, frosted pane, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was sealed shut with decades of paint and grime. Kicking it out would make a noise that would surely provoke an immediate response. I had no weapons, nothing but the clothes on my back and the contents of my pockets, a tube of melted lip balm, a few crumpled dollar bills, and my dead phone. I thought about screaming, but who would hear me? The woods were deep and empty. The road was deserted. A scream would only be a confirmation, a dinner bell. I remained silent, my jaw clenched so tight a sharp pain shot up into my temple. Time lost all meaning. I measured it in heartbeats, in the slow, rhythmic scraping of the chain as the thing outside occasionally dragged it back and forth across the door. I measured it in the flickers of the dying light bulb, each dip into darkness a small heart attack. I watched the stripe of light under the door, praying for the shadow to lift, for the sound of receding footsteps. But it remained. It was a predator, and I was its cornered prey. It was waiting for me to break, to make a sound, to try to run. Its patience was infinite, a geological patience that predated the gas station, the road, perhaps even the mountains themselves. I thought about my parents. They would have reported me missing by now. Search parties would be assembling at the trailhead. They would be looking in the woods, calling my name. They would never think to look here, in this forgotten bathroom at a closed-down gas station. I thought about my warm bed, the mundane safety of school, the stupid, trivial arguments I'd had with my friends. All of it seemed like a paradise lost, a life belonging to another person. A new sound joined the symphony of terror. A faint, high whistling. At first, I thought it was in my head, a product of my frayed nerves. But it grew steadily louder, resolving into the familiar sound of an engine and the hum of tires on asphalt. A car. A car was coming down the road. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through me. The shadow under the door did not move. The scraping of the chains did not cease. The car's headlights swept across the parking lot, two brilliant orbs that flashed through the frosted window of the bathroom, painting the walls in a momentary, blinding white. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer. It was slowing down. It was going to stop. The thing outside the door let out a low, displeased grumble. The shadow shifted. For the first time, the stripe of orange light reappeared under the door. The scraping chain sound quickened, becoming a frantic, slithering rustle. The heavy, thumping footsteps began to move away, back down the hallway. They were hurried now, no longer slow and deliberate. It was leaving. I heard the interior door to the main store swing shut with a heavy, final-sounding thud. The presence was gone. The oppressive weight lifted. Outside, a car door slammed. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed frozen in the corner, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing, which now seemed deafening. I heard voices, a man and a woman, talking in normal, conversational tones. They were by the gas pumps. I heard the clink of the fuel cap being opened. This was my chance. My only chance. I had to get out now, while the thing was gone, while these people were here. I pushed myself up, my legs screaming in protest, stiff and numb from hours of immobility. I stumbled to the door, my hand hovering over the lock. What if it was a trick? What if it was still in the main store, waiting for me to open the door? But I could hear the people outside, their mundane reality a siren call. I slid the bolt back. The sound was horribly loud in the silence. I grasped the cold metal handle, took a deep breath of the foul air, and pulled. The door opened outwards. The cold night air hit my face, a cleansing, beautiful shock. The world outside was just a gas station parking lot, but to me, it was freedom. The man and woman, a middle-aged couple in jeans and jackets, were standing by a dusty pickup truck, the pump humming as it fed gas into the tank. They looked up, startled, as I emerged from the bathroom. I must have been a sight pale, wide-eyed, covered in grime, shaking uncontrollably. "You okay, honey?" the woman asked, her voice laced with concern. I tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. I nodded, a frantic, jerky motion, and stumbled towards them, my legs threatening to buckle with every step. I glanced towards the main building. The door was closed, but it was mangled, hanging crookedly on its hinges, the metal around the frame bent outward, as if something massive had forced its way out from the inside. We saw the light," the man said, gesturing vaguely. "Thought the place might be open. You work here." I shook my head, finally finding my voice. It was a thin, reedy thing. "I was lost. In the woods. I need a ride. Please." The couple exchanged a look. I saw the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question of what a teenage girl was doing hiding in a gas station bathroom after midnight. But my fear was genuine, and it must have been palpable. "Sure, kid," the man said after a moment. "We're headed to Buchanan. Get in the truck." I didn't look back. I climbed into the cab of the pickup, the warmth and the smell of old coffee and leather an overwhelming comfort. As the man finished pumping the gas and got in, I'd kept my eyes fixed forward, on the dark road ahead. The woman asked me a few more questions, but I gave vague, monosyllabic answers. I couldn't tell them. They would never believe me. It was a secret I would have to carry alone. As we pulled onto the asphalt and drove away, I allowed myself one last glance in the side mirror. The hallways fill and go shrink behind us, its single security light a lonely, diminishing star in a sea of black. And for just a second, I thought I saw a vast, darker shape standing motionless at the tree line, watching us go, a tangle of something metallic and heavy lying at its feet. Then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. I learned several things that night. I learned that the wilderness is not just trees and animals. It is an ancient, indifferent space that can hold things we have forgotten how to name. I learned that fear is a physical force, capable of reshaping your reality. But most of all, I learned the true meaning of a safe place. It isn't a lock on a door or a roof over your head. It's the fragile, precious space between one moment of terror and the next. It's the sound of a normal voice, the warmth of a stranger's truck, the simple, unremarkable fact of a road leading towards a town. I never went back to those woods. And I never, ever take a locked door for granted.